every single civilization has their exception, so to speak, a group that bucks the trend in one way or the other. When it comes to Greek civilization, those people would be the Spartans. So we look at why they're the exception, or what makes them the exception among city-states. Now, for centuries, Sparta is basically the big kid on the block among the Greek-speaking city-states. Above all, the Spartans are known for their discipline. The most famous example of this discipline is the parable of a boy who stole a fox. Now, as part of training to become a Spartan, young boys are encouraged to steal, but they were punished for being caught. Now, apparently, a young boy was given a fox that his friends stole and told to look after it. When he was caught, the fox hid under his cloak and began to gnaw at his insides. He refused to admit his guilt and said, "Better to die without giving in to the pain than to save a life and live ever after in disgrace." Now, whether that's true or not, it certainly speaks to the ironclad discipline that was expected of all Spartans. All babies are inspected by a council of elders, and those viewed as non-advantageous to the state are left in a ravine. So they are left to the elements, and all babies are actually considered property of the state. Babies are taught to eat their food and not fear the dark or being left alone. Because above all, you are trained to serve the state. Now at age 7, children are taken from their parents and they live in barracks with boys their age. And you can think of this as the equivalent of a military company. Their education was known as the agoge, and it had the purpose of preparing them to obey orders, cope with stress, and win battles. They really lived with little in terms of material possession, hence the phrase, a Spartan existence. Theft was encouraged so that they would be able to catch the enemy off guard and they could be more resourceful soldiers on campaign. Now, the men would eat together in common dress halls, and they'd be given one tunic a year, and at age 30, they become a full citizen. Now, the Spartan male enters the military reserves at age 18, and 2 years later becomes part of a full company. Women would tell men as they left for battle, "Spartan, come back with your shield or on it." In rare instances where battles were lost, Spartans were encouraged to commit suicide rather than go home in disgrace. And even injured soldiers are expected to have wounds on the front of their bodies instead of behind, lest they promote the idea that they fled in battle. Now, religion and festivals honoring the gods were taken to be sacred and could not be shortened or disturbed. There are times where the Spartans would shuffle their feet in acting decisively in warfare because they're waiting for an omen or waiting for the end of one of their celebrations of the gods. And we already saw this with the Battle of Marathon, where the Athenians asked for help. The Spartans waited until they got the proper omen. Now, as to how they live, and you can see on the map that they're right, pretty near the middle of what's referred to as the Peloponnese. Now, this city-state is surrounded on 3 sides by mountains. It's kind of difficult to get to. Because of this, there are no walls surrounding the city, unlike pretty much every other settlement known to man. When asked about it, one Spartan famously pointed at his soldiers and declared, "These are our walls." Which, yeah, it's sort of true, but the mountains are pretty near impassable. When the Spartans began shifting to a military society, it was forbidden to write the laws down. What we know of their laws pretty much comes to us from the historian Plutarch, who wrote them down after the fact. All laws are to be transmitted orally and remembered, and all citizens really check each other from time to time. Change is viewed in a negative context, so a merchant class is forbidden because they would bring in new ideas, and we can't have new ideas. Since there's no trade, there's really no need for monetary exchange. And the only evidence of a currency we have is a specific iron currency that was only good in Sparta. Since accumulating excessive wealth is frowned upon, it really doesn't pay to hoard or, steal money in any sense. Politically speaking, Sparta, compared to Athens, Athens is a democracy. Sparta is an oligarchy, or rule of the few. The Spartans had 2 kings, so that they would never be leaderless when they marched into battle. One of the few examples of a place that actually can lead with 2 kings. The Council of Elders, who among other things inspect all infant children, was made up of citizens who were over 60 and served for life. Now they also had 5 ephors, who served for 1 year, and they cannot be re-elected. 2 of them would always accompany the army when they went out on campaign, and they yielded massive amounts of power. Only full citizens could enter into these positions, and at any given point, there's about 8,000 to 9,000 full male citizens in Sparta. Now you can see the different communities surrounding Sparta. There were about 30 that provided manufacturing and additional infrastructure for Sparta. The helots, or the slaves, were captured peoples who worked in the fields and were property of the state. The Spartans can afford to spend so much time on training and warfare because the helots do all the work for them. Now, as part of their training, Spartan youth would often have to sneak out and kill the biggest and strongest helot. In the 400s BC, it was even reported that 2,000 helots were shown to show extraordinary courage and bravery in battle because they could be conscripted to fight. After a ceremony honoring these helots, all 2,000 disappeared. So this really shows you the extremes that the Spartans would go to keep their system in play. So we have the exception of Sparta. Then we have that time where Sparta and Athens are really going to go to war. So the Persian Wars ended, but Persia is still a threat, and it calls to mind the fact that the Persians barely mention the war with the Greeks in their histories. They're going along pretty good here. The Spartans wanted to abandon the Ionian Greek city-states, and they just want to focus on the Greek mainland. But the Athenians balked at this because they were seen as the leader of the Ionians. The 2 sides do work together to reclaim the city of Byzantium, which will become Constantinople, eventually Istanbul, but it was the last time they acted as allies. The 2 sides did clash after the war ended, but signed a treaty that became known as the 30 Years' Peace. So the Athenians formed an alliance known as the Delian League, and it was named because the headquarters and treasury of the league were located on the holy island of Delos. It came from the former Hellenic League that Athens and Sparta had formed to oppose Persia. Delos is said to be the birthplace of Apollo, and it was in his temple that the delegates would meet and vote. Now, some provided ships to the league, while the smaller ones made financial contributions. As time went on, more city-states found it was just easier to contribute money rather than ships or people because their citizens are not interested in fighting. This leads to the increasing wealth of Athens, and the Athenians are going to take charge of the finances and often lead campaigns. Now, Sparta is going to watch the growth of Athenian wealth and influence with great unease, and they'll revive what was called the Peloponnesian League. Now, the actual hostilities began when Athens tried to aid a colony of the city-state of Corinth in breaking away. So Corinth had a colony. This colony tried to break away. Corinth and Athens are going to go to war because Corinth is an ally of Sparta. So now Athens and Sparta are at war due to the alliance system. Now, 18 months later, Thebes, a Spartan ally, attacks Plataea, the same place where Athens and Sparta had joined forces to defeat the Persians. Plataea had been defended by the Athenians, so the conflict escalates. Now the Spartans went to Delphi to figure out if they should go to war, and the oracle declared that they would be victorious if they threw all of their resources towards defeating Athens. Now ultimately, Sparta wins the Peloponnesian War, but all sides are weakened to the point where life is never really the same for them again, and Greek civilization is no longer going to be the power that it once was.